welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. We're here with an illustrious cast of folks, great thought leaders from across the spectrum of healthcare and life sciences, and we're going to be talking about, growth opportunities, competitive playbooks across healthcare and life sciences, and how different companies and different industry leaders look at the way healthcare is going in 2026, and what are some of the opportunities to help to drive change within the industry and take advantage of some of the growth that we're going to see in 2026. Let's start by giving each panelist a chance to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start and go clockwise, at least the group that I'm looking at here on screen. I'll start, Jim, with you. Jim Forbes is a board member of TAG Digital Health and has a long background, as I do. So we have the age here, but has done a lot of different leadership, has been in a lot of different leadership roles across healthcare and life sciences, as well as some of the other industries that have converged with healthcare as well. Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your perspective on today's session?
Thank you, Greg, and very pleased to be here with all of you today. I'm a former executive with a digital healthcare technology service provider called Vizia Technologies, and Vizia provides real-time data analytics to some of the largest hospitals and health systems in America. We were recognized by Frost Sullivan as a best practice leader for customer support, and the company was recently acquired by HID Global Corporation. I'm now a strategy consultant and serve on the boards of the Technology Association of Georgia's Digital Health Society and Georgia State University's College of Nursing and Health Professions.
Great. Thanks, Jim, and welcome. Next up, we have Zoya Brar. Zoya is Chief Operating Officer for Eli Health, which is more of a direct-to-consumer digital health company. And so, Zoya, tell us a little bit about your background, the perspective you bring today.
Yeah, I definitely don't have those many years of experience, as you can tell. But my background, actually, I started a healthcare company when I was 23 years old, and I took that to a successful acquisition a decade later. That was a molecular diagnostics company, so traditional diagnostics. And now where I represent Ellie, which is at home, or actually we call it anywhere, anytime diagnostics. And so it's still within diagnostics, but it's closer to what I think is the future of healthcare, where it's going to become more focused on the person or the patient, and less on institutions. No offense to all the institutions in the room, but I'm on the bandwagon of let's make healthcare real to an everyday ritualized, here and now perspective, as opposed to episodic or catastrophic. So yeah, that's the perspective I hope to bring today.
And certainly all those healthcare institutions are, looking to try to get more regular information and be part of how they interact with patients in the home as well. So I'm sure they're your partners as you go forward also. Next up, we have Nitin Oberoi. Nitin is business leader of the imaging franchise at Terumo Medical Company, or Corporation. I'm sure most people know Terumo. Nitin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Nitin Oberoi, and it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. I started my career with Frost Sullivan. I spent about 3-4 years there, and then I moved on the industry side. I worked with Medtronic for about 15-16 years across different businesses. And most recently now, I'm part of the Terumo Medical Corporation. As most of you are familiar, we're a company headquartered out of Japan. And I particularly sit within the Terumo interventional business. That business focuses on interventional technologies, both from a therapeutics perspective and imaging. And so imaging is a growth opportunity for us, and I have responsibility for that business in US. Thank you for having me here.
Great. No, thanks for joining. I'm going to jump up to Kustrim Kuchi. Kustrim, I think most people are probably familiar with DNA Nexus, but working in the genomic space. Kustrim is the Senior Vice President of AI and Data Products, which probably encompasses a lot of what the value that DNA Nexus brings to a lot of organizations in the current environment.
Great.
Christian,
Thanks for the introduction there. And happy to be here. So great to have this panel here. As you mentioned, I'm the Senior VP of Product at DNA Nexus. I spent over 15 years working at the intersection of healthcare data and AI, starting back in 2007 at this company called Modal, where we were building speech recognition products using machine learning and natural language to essentially help clinicians document patient visits and interact directly into EHR. That was my first exposure to this recurring problem in healthcare and then later in life sciences, who for some reason doesn't seem to go away, which is all this valuable information gets trapped into the data and the variety of data formats that are not easy to access and they're not easy to actually be reused. Today at DNA Nexus, I have the privilege of working with some of the largest players in the precision medicine. We support 18 of the 20 pharma companies. We support major diagnostic tech providers, health systems, the biobanks of the the UK biobanks, the future of health. We're supporting over 17,000 active researchers. And we become one of the largest repositories of genomics and multi-omics data with over 150 petabytes of data. That scale gives us a unique lens of where the precision medicine is heading. Certainly not based on theory, but from watching how these organizations are actually using genomics data and molecular data, whether to transform drug development, diagnostics, or patient care. So great to be here and looking forward to this conversation with this panelist and the audience.
Great. Thanks, Kush. Welcome to the panel. Last but not least, we have Frost Sullivan, one of our leaders. He's associate partner with the company. He leads up our healthcare and life science research program, Naik. Nitin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to host this session along with Greg Caressi. So I'm responsible for Frost Sullivan's healthcare and life sciences analytics. And in my previous life, also worked with GE Healthcare and A-Star in Singapore. So really have been fortunate to see both upstream as well as downstream disruptions, both from a clinical and a commercial perspective. So today I'm going to speak to some of those challenges, both in the business model and the operating model, and also actually get our panel to talk about their experiences in terms of what would that mean in shaping a playbook for 2026.
Great. Thanks, Nitin. And we're going to hand the floor over to Nitin to do an introduction and give us some insights from some of our analytics work of his team. So Nitin, I'm going to hand over to you.
Before we dive into the data and the trends, I want to start with a question which I get asked all the time by most C-suite. How optimistic is the industry and the industry community about the future of the industry per se? And I think I raised this, given this notion about the industry is cautiously optimistic, and this notion of optimism is a bit complicated. And why do I say that? If you look at the last 5 years, and especially 2025, I would put this as more where the industry looked at from moving from recovery to reinvention. And that was especially, there was so much progress, so much new innovation, product pipelines and launches launched. But the reality is we are still dealing with the complexities of regulatory uncertainty and policy changes, not to mention the geopolitical issues which we are facing all the time. So I think in today's session, we will all put our minds together and try to cut through that complexity, per se. And to really start with, what I would talk about is the industry, I think, has done a good job of coming to a stage where we are trying to be looking at the resilience aspect by using three main interlinked strategies. In my view, patient centricity is not just a tagline anymore. It's really asking those tough questions. What do we mean in terms of real outcomes for patients? How do I actually, look at when patients ask about transparency in terms of the actual results and what they're going to actually pay, because they are asking these questions all the time when they do shopping in terms of that context for the consumer industries. AI is out of the box, it's real, and it's been sort of now utilized in different aspects. And I think it'll be interesting to hear from the panel in terms of their experiences of that's how it's been shaped across the different parts, be it in drug discovery and also the downstream patient care per se. But what I would like to sort of highlight that there is this aspect of industry leaders being moving very cautiously given all these sort of changes, and I think that leads me to then talk about where do we focus our attention to. So I've picked up 5 trends, and this has come from some of our research which will be published in the next few months. These I would say are very important themes which will drive and also at the same time make sure the industry is staying on that path to growth. I talked about AI. I see AI clearly moving from now pilot to production, not just in the clinical aspect, but also looking at how physicians are actually making very important decisions on the clinical care. And this is so important. We've seen regulators, especially in the US, having an exponential jump in some of those product and the solutions. So that I think is an important direction. Early stage drug development and discovery, and I know, Kush, you will talk about it, but from my perspective, it's this confluence of how proteomics, genomics, and all the other omics technologies are now making a big breakthrough. I do still have some questions in the mind in terms of how that will have a more systemic effect, but we will talk about that in our more deeper dive discussion. I want to talk about value-based care, and this is an important concept, not just because it's relevant to the core health systems, but also now that it's moving very quickly into specialty care. We've looked at oncology, but we clearly see that impacting on more of the cardiovascular as well as some of the neurology pathways. And we see this having a big impact, not just on primary care, but also on the tertiary care systems per se. And finally, we've talked about all the progress, but it's important to keep in mind, cybersecurity as well as the related risks, and how do we actually sort of manage that in the aspect of connected health per se. So, I've polled a lot of leaders in the last few months. I was at JPM talking to the leaders, and one of the things which I think has come up pretty often is what are the main boundaries of the playbooks, and how do we actually work through those boundaries. Personally, I see the evolution in business model primarily from a financial consideration. The industry is always questioning in terms of what's the realistic operating margin, and are we able to sort of sustain that margin over the long term. There are 2 sort of primary questions to answer that. One, really this balance between ecosystem as well as point solutions. And I think that's one of the discussion points. Is this realistic? How quickly are we going to go and move through that change, especially in the regulatory navigation aspects? I personally see issues around changes in the main regulatory agencies, especially FDA, MHLW, and also in China, for example, where there is a big focus now on value-based procurement, and that leads to then the main, I would say, issue around how quickly can we move towards the aspiration of being vertically integrated, or should we be basically partnering with different companies and building our talent and culture per se. So with that, I would say really I want to close and lead into the panel discussion. and talk about some of the more important points and get our panelists to share some of those insights. So, Greg, I'll hand it over to you and
Great.
let's launch the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Nitin. That's a good overview of what we see as many of the major trends that are driving industry towards the future, including this year in 2026, and what organizations are adapting to or taking advantage of in terms of growth opportunities. Let's start with our panelists, though, to look at it from your perspective in terms of what major changes you see in 2026 that are significantly impacting the growth trajectory of your organization, as well as, are they challenges that need to be addressed, or are they tailwinds that are helping to drive business and change rapidly in the markets in which you're involved in? Who would like to take the lead on this one?
I can
Greg,
start. Oh,
yeah.
go ahead, Jim.
So, Greg, yeah, thanks. And my comments will be specific for the technology players, the vendors, the technology service providers. And Nitin, you had talked about it in your remarks about the changes to regulatory and policy out of Washington. So this has been really the headline for this year, is all of the rapid changes that nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid have impacted all parts of the healthcare ecosystem. I think about for the healthcare providers, they're having delayed reimbursements. They're having increased labor costs that are all hitting their budgets very, very hard. Greg, up in your backyard in New York City, we've got 15,000 nurses that are on strike for the third week, and they're demanding a 40% increase in their salaries. So this is going to be a big budget item for healthcare providers across the country. And then likewise for the insurance providers, they have just been announced this week from CMS that the increases for their reimbursements from the government for 2027 is only going to be less than 1%. They had anticipated 5%. So when the announcement came out this week, the publicly traded insurance carriers, they lost $96 billion in market capitalization alone this week. And then, of course, for the patients, the end of the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act and an overall increase in their premiums of about 20% this year. So these are significant headlines and headwinds that the entire industry is facing. But Greg, to your point about what are potential tailwinds, we have a great opportunity with one of the components of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and that was the allocation of $50 billion to be allocated towards rural hospitals. And that's going to be doled out $10 billion a year for the next 5 years. And states are just now being notified by the CMS of their funds allocated for this year alone. And they are in the neighborhood of approximately $200 million each state for this year. So for the technology providers, this is a great opportunity to help the rural hospitals implement these digital technologies that they are already have made submissions to, which has to do with upgrading electronic health records, implementing telehealth, and then Nitin talked about cybersecurity, very much lacking in the rural healthcare system. So this is a great opportunity for the vendors to partner up and to really bridge that digital divide in rural America.
So definitely an area that we need to focus on here and over the coming decade, as we see many of these rural hospitals struggling, but having a crucial role in supporting our population. Kush, I saw you were ready to throw in something as well. Why don't we go to you next? Yeah.
Sure. And I'm going to contextualize this within sort of the omics space and then the life sciences in particular. But we're seeing three major shifts here, some of which are tailwinds for us in 2026, but also for the industry at large. So first, the omics and molecular data are being generated in a clinical setting as a standard practice of care. And the diagnostic data it's increasingly feeding into the population health efforts. In drug development, especially in oncology and rare diseases, we're seeing an increasingly organized around these molecular profiles rather than just phenotypes alone. Second, another trend here is the volume of this omics data is compounding faster than the productivity itself. Let me give you some examples. Between 2000 and 2021, there were over 40,000 clinical trials that included omics data. Today, we're seeing about 7,000 new omics trials launching every year. The entirety of the global omics-based clinical trial market has grown from $32 billion in 2024, and it's projected to go to $71 billion by 2034. We also have some examples of omics accumulation within pharma, be it the accumulation of exomes, genomes, the millions of genetic tests that are being processed by the diagnostics providers and whatnot. And here's the headwind. The problem is that all of this omics data is accumulating, but it's being accumulated in disparate places across various formats, and there is utility to be unlocked. But all this information is being tracked inside piles of these files. And in short, the omics data volume is compounding, but the time to insight what we're observing and the productivity is not. The third observation that we're seeing is that now organizations are starting to realize that they need to really operationalize the accumulation of this omics data. So historically, if you look at what has happened, omics data was used as a point solution. You run a test, you diagnose an individual or patient of cohorts, you make a therapeutic decision, and that is it. But now organizations have millions of files. They can easily query across them, combine them with clinical data, or feed them into the AI models without sort of massive data engineering projects. So now organizations are realizing the need to operationalize their omics data into what we call reusable enterprise data assets, because now that has to feel the ongoing intelligence of being able to query, being able to cohort your patients, and feed that into AI with the goal of reaching scientific insights as quickly as you possibly can. So if I were to contextualize this, what does this really mean in terms of accumulation of omics? For pharma, instead of teaching or treating each clinical trials as an isolated data set, now they can query across multiple trials to identify patterns for drug repurpose, refining patient selection criteria, or even understanding why certain drugs, for example, work in some population but not in others. We have examples from diagnostic companies. Natera is an example. They were able to actually use millions of accumulated tests to improve their algorithms, and they took essentially 2 million prenatal tests and used them to train their AI model to improve the accuracy dramatically. For health systems, we're also seeing genomics text result now being informing population health strategies, identifying high-risk individuals, and being able to tailor treatment that are based on molecular profiles. So that's what we're seeing happening in the industry. That's where we're taking our platform. Instead of sort of focusing now on just generating insights, one informatics algorithm at a time, to becoming that platform of building the ongoing data organization. And so there is an opportunity there to transform this fragmented omics into standardized, structured, queryable data assets and have them be ready for the agentic era.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big challenges of AI and analytics overall is how do we put this data into a usable form at a large scale. Zoya, I'm sure you have a different perspective from the home as a health hub that Nitin mentioned. Maybe we can get your insights in terms of what you see as the challenges and the drivers for 2026.
Yeah, I'm definitely not cautiously optimistic. I'm very optimistic. So
Okay.
I think that comes a bit from where I sit on the spectrum of healthcare right now. I think as far as the patient, and that's I won't even call it the patient, I'd say the consumer, because really it is in our case, we are hoping to reach them before they become patient and really join health as a wellness more than health as, like I was saying earlier, catastrophe or chronic problem. Like that's already too late. So when I talk about that consumer, I think they are so much more educated, so much more willing and wanting to access information on their health. They are so much more curious than they were a decade ago, that they're prepped and ready for any tool that can, give them more answers, that can empower them, that can take them, one step closer to having more autonomy in this very chaotic healthcare world that we are in right now. So I think I mean, from a business perspective, it makes sense to invest there, where there is more certainty, more control in some ways than on what Jim and Kush were mentioning. There's so much chaos on the other end that I feel like we are in a good spot. Anyone who's focusing there right now, I think that's one piece. The second piece is, I think, with AI, of course, the data challenges and all of that, I totally agree with Kush, what you said. But I think the positive spin is that, again, users are, or consumers have now their little phone, which has everything right here, right? So they're participants in that process, and they're not just getting a genomics report. They're feeding it to their chat GPT. They're correlating it with their aura. They're correlating it with what the notes that their doctor fed them during a live consultation. They're correlating it with what happened with their gym instructor. They're putting in the supplements, and they're creating protocols whether we like it or not. So I think that's the reality, which is super exciting from my perspective. And I feel like anyone who's embracing that and at the forefront of that, rather than, worried or, like, I mean, lots of healthcare companies I know are just going like, no AI in some ways. And I think they are going to, they're going to regret it at some point. So, yeah, that's me.
Zoya,
Okay.
you're spot on. There's now 40 million people in the US that use ChatGPT daily for healthcare-related questions. So it's really a growing thing, which actually the clinicians appreciate, having a much more educated consumer having an intelligent conversation with them.
Yep, that's the future, whether we like it or not.
Nidhi, how about from your perspective in terms of, a medical device organization that is, looking at the imaging world changing as well?
Yeah. Before I get to that, I just want to, again, comment and build on what Jim and Zoya said on the ChatGPT. I was actually reading an article yesterday. Someone's life was saved because of ChatGPT. So this person had, I think he had very high, he had normal blood pressure, but pulse rate was very low. And then he just, did it standing, sitting, and then he just put in the measurements in ChatGPT, and they said, it's emergency, you should go to the hospital. So he ended up getting a procedure. So just another example of, this is real and this is happening. It's not going to replace physicians, but I think certainly it's helping. Now, from an imaging perspective, as procedures move more minimally invasive, there's increased opportunity for imaging. Now, particularly where I sit in intravascular imaging and speaking from a coronary space, it's a good story there. We last year, our societies gave Class 1A recommendation for routine use of intravascular imaging in complex coronary procedures. So what that means is that there's strong evidence that is promoting usage of imaging as part of the procedure. And if you just look at opportunities, there are about 1 million procedures, like coronary artery procedures that require stenting, are done. And only 25-30% of those procedures are currently using intravascular imaging. So you just see the opportunity. It's such a huge market development opportunity there. Now, there are things we need to address, and I know there was some comments around reimbursement. Now, on the reimbursement for intravascular imaging, we don't have separate reimbursement. It's all part of one procedure payment. So there's opportunity to have separate reimbursement, and hopefully with the Class 1A indication, societies will push for reimbursement. And then last but not the least, AI, I think we're going to talk about it in detail later today. I don't think it's a trend, it's real. The question is not if it's relevant, it's like, how do you make it relevant for your organization, for your business, for your customers? So it's all about application and applying it in your world.
Maybe that's a good transition to our next topic. Nitin, I'll hand it over to you to get us going in that section. And you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I think 2024 was when we saw the first sort of landing and the mainstream use of AI. But before we jump into that, I want to put a comment, based the earlier question. I mean, it seems that the care delivery as well as the entire delivery models are being reinvented, right? So it's important that you are looking at it from that perspective. And the question in my mind is, what is that purposeful transformation? And I really think AI or machine learning and those platforms sort of fit in very nicely, because yes, as we're hearing, it's not a choice, it's already out of the box, right? And where and how do we basically make use of those tools and technologies to really drive meaningful outcomes? So really my question, and it would be interesting to hear from the panel, how is AI and machine learning changing your sector today? But also interestingly, how has that impacted your personal leadership styles and goals within your organization? I know, Kush, you talked about, especially on the early stage, right? And it's complicated.
Absolutely.
It's not easy to measure and demonstrate to ROI to CIOs and CTOs, in especially biotech companies. But yeah, maybe we could start with you and get a sense of, is that moving quickly? Is that really making an impact? And how easy is to have a conversation about AI with both patients and providers?
So just within our context, we don't necessarily deal directly there with providers and patients, but this is what I'm going to say. There's no question that AI is changing what's possible in precision medicine. I think this convergence of genomics with AI, it's really allowing us to transform this large-scale data into what I would call sort of like predictive engine for human health. And let me give you some very concrete examples. And lo and behold, I mean, the regulatory framework still has to catch up, right? We can talk about sort of the nature of these large language models, how they operate, the lack of explainable AI comparison to like machine learning type of, good old statistical analysis kind of thing. But coming back to this generative AI, we talked a lot about ChatGPTs of the like. AI, it's democratizing who can work with omics data. What we're seeing, for example, in the past, analyzing omics data was a thing of researchers. You had to have bioinformaticians, computational biologists, data scientists. They required that high level technical and data knowledge expertise in order to analyze this data. But now generative AI has changed that equation. It's allowing us access to this multi-omics data, or ability to interact with the data using natural language. And that sort of like, it opens up the aperture, the wider range of user who can interact with the data. So for example, a user now can go and ask the system, show me all patients with BRCA1 mutations who responded to this therapy, and they'll get an answer from AI handling the whole technical execution. Zero SQL knowledge required. And now the end user is all of a sudden interacting with data using natural language. We're also seeing examples of researchers now performing cohort type analysis. They're doing feature engineering, even some basic machine learning, all through natural language, which used to take weeks back in the days when we were at a modal, to now basically in hours. And as everybody here in the audience mentioned, why this is important? Well, because people now have more expectations. They've been exposed to tools like ChatGPT. They're becoming accustomed to building things using natural language. And so now I think what we need to change, and how the industry needs to think about the end users, is that they're no longer just consumers. They are not just informaticians. They're builders themselves. They want to build on top of our platform because things are getting easier to be built. The second trend that I think is very important to bring up is we're starting to see this new pharma archetype that are AI native from day one. So you can think of them almost like a operating system for drug discovery. Let me give you some examples without necessarily sort of mentioning company names, but we're seeing instances where Companies are using sort of like automated biology to run millions of weekly experiments, feeding petabyte of data set into a supercomputer to find drug targets that humans would have missed. There is another organization who's sort of building on top of Google's DeepMind AlphaFold algorithm, and they're treating this whole drug design as a digital information problem. They're about to move into clinical trials without sort of the traditional wet lab trial and error. We're also seeing where machine learning now can bridge the gap between lab data and human clinical outcomes, which is helping these large pharma companies de-risk the early stages of the clinical trials by predicting which drug will succeed better than before you enter the trial itself. There's so many other examples there. Not probably this one, it's less omics related, but I was reading this news actually a couple of months ago, but AI, for example, is also accelerating computational chemistry and creating molecules that nature could have not created. So there was this article in the Researchers magazine where an AI model was designed to completely create this new fluorescent protein, which would have taken 500 million years to evolve in nature and whatnot. And so, long story short here, these trends are giving us the early indicators of where the end users are going. And it's requiring that all the platforms there to actually be built with open standards for interoperability and be agentic ready. That doesn't mean just have AI features. That means that having APIs that can interact with AI agents that can be programmatically triggered while also maintaining the strict security and compliance, specifically within our domain. And all of that is going to require, data be harmonized, enriched, stored in formats that this AI agents can interact with and models can consume. And the last thing that I'll just add is consumers now, customers want more optionality. I want to bring my own AI models, and I want to apply that to my data without sort of massive data engineering process. So a lot of things have changed with AI. I share my sentiment with Zoya. I'm very optimistic where this is going, despite some of the opportunities of generative AI, this large language model, algorithms that they still sort of don't do the causation. It's more on the correlation kind of things, but things have changed. They've changed, in my view, for the good.
And if I may just contextualize this, right, Kush, I mean, it looks like, at least in your sector, we've been reading sort of one chapter of a biological story at a time, right? Genomics was telling us about DNA, and then proteomics about expression, but now we're reading an entire book. Seems to be, that pathway. Zoya, Nidhi, I mean, how's that in your, part of the world?
Yeah, I would say it's not even an entire book anymore. We don't even know where it starts and ends. It's that. But I'll go back to the question you were earlier asking, Nitin, on how like the implementation of AI within organizations, and how kind of, even though I'm at a startup, so I don't have any of the, I guess, bureaucracy that comes with larger organizations, so it's much easier. But I feel like insurgents or newer companies actually have a very big advantage here, because when you're starting from scratch or you have less rigid structures to contend with, you can really, that can be your playbook to start. And so we, for example, are AI first. Before we hire somebody, we ask the question, can AI do this? Is there a tool that can do this? And that's, that while, and hiring is one, but whether it's getting a partner on board, whether there is getting a physical, like even how we develop our product. Kush was mentioning the way you design your experiments. There are so many smarter, creative, faster, cheaper ways to do things now. If you just go by the traditional way of doing it, you're going to become irrelevant very soon. So I think just being able to implement it as a default in every organization, while keeping in mind, obviously, cybersecurity and protocols and all of that I don't take away from, is a key advantage that I would say smaller companies and startups and insurgents right now have.
Wonderful. So it looks like it's not future state, it's happening now, and it's for real. So with that, I want to pivot to Nidhi, actually, specifically on your business. where hospital systems are consolidating and they're demanding, integrated solutions. What does this mean for your company's playbook?
Yeah, so from an imaging perspective, I would say there's transformation happening from visualization to clinical decision making, right? And so, just to give you some example, what AI means for our or imaging businesses. So, if a patient needs to get a stent procedure done, there are so many different tests that are done along the journey of the patient. There's CT scans, there's in angiography, there's intravascular imaging, there's FFR. So all of these tests are trying to understand the anatomy of the patient and also the physiology, which is how much blood is flowing into the vessel so that physicians can make the right decision. So here there's how AI is transforming and integration comes into play is AI gives you the ability to take automated measurements of the lesion. So physicians don't have to take manual measurements, which saves time. It drives procedural efficiency. It helps classify the type of plaque, like is it fibrous, is it calcium, so better characterization of the disease, which in turn helps in better selection of the stent. Now, where integration and consolidation comes in is there are already physicians asking how we can have integrated systems where they can see these images, all these different images that they're doing as part of the patient's workup, and make decisions accordingly. So this is where thinking of how hardware can integrate with the software, that's where it comes in. So that's one part of the integration. How do you integrate multiple modalities of imaging within your systems? The second part of integration is how do you integrate within the workflow of the hospital? So they're not a fan of multiple systems, and they want everything to be integrated into their existing workflow. And this is where starting with people where they are, rather than trying to change their behavior. I think you need to integrate into their workflow. So I think all of these things are real, and for any company as they are thinking for future product development opportunities, whether organic or M&A or strategic partnerships, they need to think very intentionally about these things. And from an organizational perspective, I feel like it's healthy pragmatism. There are a lot of digital centers of excellence coming up in the organization from a technology perspective. I think that's needed to build that expertise, but it's equally important that they talk to the customers, they talk to the commercial teams, they talk to the clinical teams, so that this technology is an enabler. It shouldn't be the other way around. You should be trying to fit technology. It's how you are making it relevant for the customer to solve their problem.
Yeah, while we're on this AI topic, maybe I'll jump to Jim, and I'll ask a couple questions. I mean, one is, we do see AI starting to move closer to real clinical workflows. So the question that we had for you was, what do patients, providers, and payers expect along this AI implementation journey? And maybe I'll also piggyback on one of the things that Nidhi said that we often talk about in healthcare is people don't want changes in their workflow. But in reality, 5 years from now, AI, if we're going to really leverage it, we're going to have to change workflows. I mean, we're going to have to. Agentic AI is going to, change them by nature. So tell us a little bit about how you see this, this AI change impacting patients, providers, and payers, and then, the workflow question I would like us to address as a group at least.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Greg. So, we all know that healthcare providers right now are just drowning in data, that we've got, advanced medical devices, IoT sensors, and new cloud-based software platforms. It's creating a tsunami of data. And so what they're really valuing from technology partners is how can they filter that intelligently and meet them where they're at with their workflows, and what are actionable insights, used to be called clinical decision support. So it's just helping the clinician to make better decisions quicker. And so, Nitin, you had talked about it migrating from pilots to production. And so really that's key now is that what patients and providers are looking for is a seamless integration from bench to bedside. I know for many of us now that when we meet with our physicians, we're accepting of AI scribes, of ambient listening, and that really helps for updating charting, electronic health records. You're able to have a more conversation with your provider, with your clinician, and they're not spending time doing charting right in front of you. And that results in a much more positive experience for the patient. And then for the healthcare system, that can relate into higher HCAP scores. But I do want to highlight a really, really great AI success story for clinical workflows. It's a company called Viz.ai, and that was founded by Dr. Chris Manzi, a neurosurgeon turned entrepreneur. And they're a leading provider of AI clinical workflow solutions. And they now have over 50 FDA-approved algorithms. And they were the first company to be awarded CMS reimbursement for AI. So they've now been rapidly deployed in over 2,000 hospitals in the US. So there are some great examples that are out there, and that's the trifecta. If you can have something that is clinician-led, FDA approved, and CMS reimbursed, and to help those companies that are on that journey, venture capital has really taken note of it. Last year alone, they invested $18 billion into AI healthcare applications, which represented 50% of all investments that venture capital and private equity made into healthcare technology companies. So the use cases are out there. There are people who are on the leading edge for it. And this is what healthcare executives are looking for, those validated proof points. And they desperately need those types of verified solutions brought into their facilities.
Yeah, the investors are definitely very hot on AI in healthcare. I mean, if you look at almost every $100 million round, the large rounds that we saw last year, I mean, 85% of them were companies that were, doing something very significant with AI in their solution. So,
But I would add the piece that I guess will remain a moat is the hardware, especially in biotech.
Point.
I think that's when we talk about AI, we forget, like that's because a lot of those companies that today are raising that money may not exist because somebody else will be able to do it faster and quicker. But companies that are working on hardware innovation, that's going to be very hard to replicate. At least I don't see any signs of that using AI. It'll be easier to make it more productive and faster and quicker. But so I think that's worth investing in, despite all of the AI shine.
Good news for Ellie and for Nidhi on that front, on your companies. Nitin, did you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about AI and of course about how it's impacting the care delivery model. I want to pivot back to Kush, right? Especially given the diversity of the work you do with different customer groups, pharma and biotech and health systems. How are you really positioning your platform and the partnership strategies? These segments are so diverse.
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. Let me start by just saying, what are some of the key ingredients into AI? You have data and the dimensionality of the data that comes with that. You have algorithms, you have compute power, and you have people, right? So this is sort of like the four key ingredients that go into the AI. By and large, majority of these organizations are not necessarily trying to compete on algorithmic competition or compute. These are sort of what I would call more like the AI first companies, the hyperscalers of Anthropics of the like and OpenAI and whatnot that are creating foundational models. The human element is certainly important. But I'm going to come back to data. So let me start by just kind of giving you a view of like genomics and omics data have been active in research environments supporting diagnostic, clinical research organization, clinical trials, and also internal healthcare organizations, sort of like testing. All of the data has lived in isolation. And I spoke earlier about how these omics results are continuing to accumulate. Now we're starting to like seeing a shift towards accumulating this data to drive larger scale research and translational insight. So in pharma, for example, omics data was traditionally a point in time tool for clinical trial enrollment criteria. Today, the data set is piling up. And they're being used to actually think trial design and drug repurposing. And these companies are starting to think more about like, well, how do I approach the clinical trial identification? On the diagnostic companies, they're evolving from going for pure transactional testing, simply returning these results, to viewing their data as a high value output. So they're starting to think about, well, how do I recycle their accumulated product data? How can I fuel my R&D for future tests? And how do I commercialize that large scale data for insights? In health systems, in the past, we've supported the research side of academic medical centers, not the point of care. That's also changing. So to answer your question, like, what's changing and how we're preparing, most recently, we announced a strategic partnership with Oracle. This was from last September, which they had acquired Cerner and now operates as Oracle EHR. Now we're embedded into the design of their new EHR as a precision health clinical module. This product will launch in the second half of 2026 and will continue to scale in 27. But what we're doing there, we're helping these care providers make sense of those molecular testing at the point of care and not sort of like in isolation. You have a new variant that comes through our platform, it gets annotated, it gets enriched, and you can go back and feed that information back to the EHR to reclassify that particular variant. And that now starts to contribute as a clinical support tool for ultimately for better patient outcomes. We're also starting to see some movements on the regulators. So we've supported them, the FDA sort of more the research environment. Now we're being pulled into this regulatory submission workflows, particularly for personalized drugs with genomics definition. And where this data requirements are broader and a lot more complex, and you have this whole global standard gateway that certainly doesn't exist. So in short, across all of these market segments, this accumulated omics data is creating a value for our organization in terms of how it's organized. Can it be queried? Can it be accessible for ongoing analysis? Can it be repurposed or reused and not be trapped in files? And that's the product offering. That's where our technology and our platform is evolving to make sure that this omics data layer can be deployed in anyone's account, can be accessible, can support federated learning. It's agentic ready and allows and gives the flexibility to our customers in terms of not sort of like fighting your do-it-yourself kind of methodology, but have them participate in this. Like, you want to use your tool, you can use your tool. Because at the end of the day, it is the data. It's the dimensionality of the data that needs to serve, whether just like for pure statistical analysis or even for AI model creations and whatnot.
And a whole different segment, and this is a great perspective, but a very different segment is at-home diagnostics area, where Zoya, you and Ellie play. We saw a huge growth during the pandemic. We've seen a consolidating market, still a lot of small companies in the space that are trying to do innovative things. What do you see as the strategy for sustaining growth in that consumer health testing market that is important, as we've talked about, and creates a lot of that data that we are trying to increasingly utilize? But it's a market where there's always been questions about who pays, for example, and how we continue to grow in that space.
I think, at least from my lens, demand is really not the question. The real, I guess, challenge or the real focus that will help companies differentiate over this decade is going to be execution. Because on this side, the regulatory, geopolitical risk, everything is so non-defined and opaque, and it's not even opaque. It's just nobody yet knows where it's going. I'm sure you guys heard about the warning letter that went out to Whoop, and then the changes that happened in the wellness policy from the FDA. Like, there's so much. Every day you wake up, it's a new day. So I guess remaining kind of agile and keeping your systems and processes flexible, and prepared to embrace that, I think will differentiate. That's one. I also think having technology that is not rigid, it's hard to do, especially in hardware. But if you can, like as an example, at Ellie, we had a choice whether we should have a reader along with the strip, the test strip, and we decided not to put the reader, and we put it in the mobile phone, which took us additional development time. But really thinking through, 10 years later, where are my investments going to go, and ensuring that wherever there's a possibility to remain flexible, I would say make that choice. It's, of course, makes logical sense, but oftentimes that's not how business decisions are made in organizations.
Well, yeah, pressure to get to time to market and get something out. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's really going to be the key differentiator as we go forward.
Okay, that's great. It's been a great discussion. We're nearing the end of our time. We're going to go slightly over, but I would ask each of you to answer one last question, because we always have people who are from outside the healthcare industry in our webinars. And so what I'd like for you to do is to take off your hat at your org, or to, from that perspective, say if you could implement one strategy for a company who is outside of healthcare and life sciences to help take advantage of these trends and support the healthcare and life sciences industry, what would it be? Let's start with Nidhi.
Yeah, so believe in the philosophy of meeting people where they are, and so a lot of my technology friends in the technology companies, they're raving about Microsoft Copilot, how that's integrated into the Microsoft application, and they're really leveraging it to summarize their emails, their projects. So I think going around that concept, I would just try to take that best practice of, in our imaging world, how do we integrate into the workflows of the physician community as best as possible? So that would be my take there.
Yeah, that's a great point for somebody who wants to sell into the market. You have to fit within the workflows. Jim, what's your perspective, or what's your key there?
Yeah, I'm a big fan, as all of us are users of Amazon, and Nitin had talked about customer centricity, and so a key leadership principle, for Amazon is just customer obsession, where the whole executive team focuses first on the customer and works backwards. Vendors typically focus on the technology itself, and so my recommendation to technology partners is to flip the script and spend time up front collaborating with clinicians, as Nidhi had mentioned, meeting them where they are, and then providing the solution that will give them a demonstrable outcome that impacts patient care. That's really key, that we focus and reverse the script. And a real savvy move is for technology vendors is to hire a nurse or a clinician as a subject matter expert or a board advisor.
That's a great point. All right. And a number of great points, sorry. But we see that executed, and people need to pay attention to those facts to play in the healthcare world. Zoya, what would you say from your space?
I mean, I would say there are two pieces that come to my mind. One, longevity and wellness is here, and it's a consumer good now. It's not in the domain of healthcare anymore. And I feel anyone that's doing anything it's going to become the next big thing from my lens. And I think no matter which industry you are in, you need to be taking it seriously. So that's one. The second, I think this sounds a bit regressive, but technology companies, when they started out, had it right when they talked about culture being kind of front and center. And I think with AI, technology is now table stakes. It's accessible. It's with everyone. What's really going to differentiate companies is people, and it's going to be the few people that you hire and that you keep and that you are able to motivate over the long run, that are able to deal with all the technology that's coming. Those are going to make or break. So I'd say that culture is even more important today than it was back then.
Okay, that's great. Great perspective. Kush, wrap us up and tell us from your seat, what would you tell these companies that are not in the healthcare world, how they can add to these the successes in
Absolutely.
healthcare and life sciences?
Yeah, I'll continue to remain hopeful forever that one day interoperability will become a thing in healthcare and life sciences. But if I were to take a parallel sort of vertical there, I would implement the collaborative model that GitHub has created for software developments, where individuals contributed to the shared knowledge base while also maintaining control of their own code. And everybody benefited from that collective advancements. And we're trying to build something similar. And I would say, for precision medicine. So if you think today, pharma companies, they're accumulating this genomic data from clinical trials. A diagnostic companies has millions of test results. Health systems have patient molecular testing data. And all of this data are just sitting in silos. And I think the big breakthrough here from insight standpoint, especially now with the advancement of AIs that we discussed it in here, comes from training these AI models across all of this data for you to understand what is my disease progression, what is my treatment response predictors, and what are those survivor models. So I think there is a plentiful of examples outside of healthcare. Now, understandably, the regulatory framework needs to also stay advanced because things need to be done with security in mind, with the right policies and compliance and whatnot. But that would be an industry that I would look for inspiration, that things can be done elsewhere. Because I refuse to believe that, pharma doesn't want to learn from what's happening on the clinical, side of things and vice versa. I think the whole constituents of the ecosystem would have benefited from this.
Yeah, that's a great point. Other industries have broken fragmentation in their sectors, and that's an area that's a challenge. We have so much advanced analytics and AI that can be applied, but the baseline data integration is still a challenge for us in healthcare. So it's a great point to wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists for all of the great insights. It's been an interesting discussion. I really appreciate the different viewpoints that everybody brought today.